The stars stretched endlessly before Captain Daniel Hayes as he stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge. 300 years had passed since humanity's last war, and most people had forgotten what that even meant. Daniel was 42 years old, with gray starting to show in his dark hair, and he had spent his entire career mapping unexplored systems in the outer rim of known space. His crew was small but efficient. Amy Carter sat at the pilot's station with her hands dancing across the controls as she guided them through a dense asteroid field. She was 28 and had been flying since she was 16. Lucas Grant worked in the engine room below, and his voice crackled over the comm system every few minutes with status updates. He was the best engineer Daniel had ever worked with and could fix anything with whatever materials he had on hand. Sophie Brooks stood beside Daniel studying the scanner readouts. She was the ship's xenobiologist, and at 35, she had cataloged more alien species than anyone else in the fleet. They were 6 months into a 2-year survey mission, and so far they had discovered 12 new star systems and 2 planets that might support human colonization. It was routine work, but Daniel loved it. He had joined the exploration service because he wanted to see what was out there beyond Earth's borders. He wanted to find new worlds and meet new species and expand humanity's understanding of the universe. War was something he read about in history books. His grandfather had fought in the last conflict against an aggressive alien empire called the Zentari. That war had lasted 3 years and ended with such devastating human victory that every other species in the galaxy had learned a simple lesson. Leave humanity alone. The Krillian Empire controlled 40 star systems in the galactic north. They were a reptilian species that stood 7 feet tall with scales that ranged from deep green to black. Their civilization was built on concepts of honor and strength, and they respected only power. For 3 centuries, they had traded peacefully with humanity. They sold rare minerals and bought human technology. The relationship was cordial if not warm. But something had changed in recent years. The current High Chancellor was a warrior named Victor, who believed that the old stories about human military might were exaggerated. He looked at humanity's 300 years of peace and saw weakness. He saw a civilization that had grown soft and comfortable. He saw an opportunity. The attacks started small. A mining station on the edge of human space went silent. When rescue ships arrived, they found everyone dead and the valuable or stolen. Admiral Kevin Walsh commanded Frontier Command from a massive space station called Sentinel Prime. He was 56 with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. When he received the report about the mining station, he immediately suspected the Krillians. The method of attack matched their style, and sensor logs showed ships with Krillian energy signatures in the area. He sent a formal complaint to the Krillian government and demanded an investigation. The response he received was dismissive. The Krillians claimed they had no knowledge of any attack and suggested that pirates were responsible. 2 weeks later, another station was hit. This time there were survivors who confirmed that Krillian soldiers had carried out the attack. 140 people died. Admiral Walsh sent another message to the Krillians, and this time his tone was harder. He warned that further attacks would be considered acts of war. Victor received the message aboard his flagship while reviewing fleet deployment plans. He laughed when he read Walsh's warning. His advisors laughed with him. They all agreed that humanity had become too comfortable with peace. The humans talked about diplomacy and sanctions, but they would never actually fight. It had been 300 years since they had gone to war. Their military was probably ceremonial by now. Their weapons were likely outdated. Their soldiers had never seen real combat on Earth. President Claire Morgan sat in her office reviewing the intelligence reports. She was 49 years old and had served as president for 6 years. She had won election on a platform of expanded exploration and increased trade with alien civilizations. She believed in diplomacy and cooperation. She believed that problems could be solved through discussion and compromise. But she also knew history. She knew what her predecessors had built into the foundations of human government after the war with the Zentari. Deep in military archives there were protocols that had never been deleted. There were plans that had never been abandoned. There were doctrines that waited dormant for the day. They might be needed again. Claire called an emergency meeting with her military advisors. Admiral Walsh attended via hologram from Sentinel Prime, the chief of naval operations, was there along with the heads of all military branches. They reviewed the attacks and discussed options. Economic sanctions were proposed. Diplomatic isolation was suggested. Travel restrictions were debated. But Admiral Walsh spoke up, and his voice was grave. He said that the Krillians were testing them. They were probing for weakness. If humanity responded with only words and sanctions, then the attacks would escalate. Claire asked him what he recommended. Walsh said they needed to show strength. They needed to position military forces along the border. They needed to make it clear that further attacks would be met with overwhelming force. The room fell silent. Claire looked at each person present, and then she gave the order. The military would deploy defensive fleets to protect the colonies. Daniel and his crew were still months away from all of this. The horizon's edge was deep in unexplored space where news traveled slowly. They had just finished mapping a system with 7 planets when Amy picked up something unusual on the long-range sensors. She called Daniel over to look at the readings. There were ships out there, and a lot of them. At least 200 vessels moving in formation. Sophie ran the energy signatures through the database and confirmed they were Krillian. Daniel frowned. There was no reason for a Krillian fleet to be this far from their territory. He ordered Amy to take them closer, but to keep their distance and stay hidden behind a moon dot as they watched the Krillian fleet. Daniel recorded everything. Lucas boosted the sensor array so they could pick up communications. What they heard made Daniel's blood run cold. The Krillians were planning an invasion. They were going to attack multiple human colonies simultaneously. The target date was 2 weeks away. The fleet would hit the agricultural world of New Haven first. 5 million civilians lived there. It was one of humanity's breadbasket worlds where vast farms fed dozens of other colonies. Daniel immediately sent an emergency transmission to Frontier Command. He marked it Priority 1 and included all the sensor data they had gathered. Admiral Walsh received the message 18 hours later. He watched the recordings 3 times. He studied the fleet composition and the planned attack routes. Then he activated Protocol Achilles. The dormant war machine that humanity had kept sleeping for 3 centuries began to wake up. The Krillian Armada arrived at New Haven exactly when their intercepted communications said they would. Daniel had pushed the horizon's edge to maximum speed, trying to reach the colony before the attack, but they were still 3 hours away when the bombardment began. From their position in deep space, they could only watch the sensor readings and listen to the desperate communications flooding every channel. The Krillian fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation with their weapons already charged. They did not bother with warnings or demands for surrender. The first volley of plasma cannons struck the orbital defense platforms and vaporized them in seconds. New Haven had no military presence because it was a farming world far from any contested borders. The only weapons were those carried by local security forces. Amy sat frozen at her controls as she listened to the screams coming through the emergency channels. Lucas had come up from the engine room and stood behind Daniel's chair with his hands clenched into fists. Sophie was crying silently as she monitored the life sign readings from the surface. Entire cities were being erased? The Krillians targeted population centers first. They wanted maximum casualties to send a message. 5 million people lived on New Haven, and in the first hour of the attack, 2 million died. The agricultural domes that produced food for 20 other colonies were shattered. The careful irrigation systems that had taken 50 years to build were destroyed. Fields that stretched for hundreds of miles burned under plasma. Daniel gave the order to jump into the system, even though he knew his small exploration ship could do nothing against a fleet of 200 warships. But there were people dying down there, and he could not just run away. When they emerged from hyperspace, the battle was already over. The Krillian fleet was preparing to leave. They had accomplished their goal of terror and destruction. The horizon's edge immediately began broadcasting rescue signals and headed for the surface. What they found there would haunt them forever. Entire cities were rubble. Bodies lay in the streets. The few survivors wandered in shock looking for family members. Daniel's crew worked for 18 hours straight, pulling people from collapsed buildings and loading them onto the ship. They saved 3,000 people, but there should have been millions. Among the survivors was a little girl named Lily Patterson, who was 8 years old. She had been at school when the attack started, and her teacher had pushed her into an emergency shelter before the building collapsed. When Sophie found her, she was sitting alone in the ruins holding a stuffed bear. Her parents were dead. Her 2 brothers were dead. Her entire neighborhood was gone. Sophie carried her back to the ship and stayed with her in the medical bay. Lily did not speak for 2 days. She just stared at the wall with empty eyes. The images and recordings that Daniel transmitted back to Earth arrived 12 hours after the attack ended. Every news network broadcast them. Every citizen saw the devastation. Every person understood that something fundamental had changed. President Claire Morgan stood before the camera in the White House press room with her face pale but her voice steady. She had not slept since the attack began. She had spent the night in emergency meetings with her cabinet and military leadership. Now she addressed not just humanity but every species in the galaxy. She stated that the Krillian Empire had committed an act of war and an atrocity against innocent civilians. She demanded that High Chancellor Victor surrender himself for trial, and that the Krillian government pay reparations and withdraw all forces from human space immediately. She gave them 48 hours to comply. The message was broadcast on every diplomatic channel. Victor received it aboard his flagship. While celebrating the successful attack on New Haven, he watched Claire's address with his senior commanders gathered around. When she finished speaking, Victor began to laugh. His officers joined in. The human president looked tired and frightened. Her demands were the desperate threats of a weak leader. Victor ordered his communications officer to send a response. He looked directly into the camera and spoke in heavily accented English so the humans would understand him clearly. He said that New Haven was only the beginning. He said that humanity had grown soft during their long peace. He said that the Krillian Empire would take 12 more human worlds by the end of the month. He said that Earth itself would kneel before him within a year. Then he cut the transmission and ordered his fleet to proceed to their next target. On Earth, that response played on every screen. Claire watched it in the Situation Room surrounded by her advisors. When it ended, she sat in silence for a long moment. Then she looked at Admiral Walsh and gave a single order. She told him to activate Protocol Achilles with full authorization. Walsh nodded and began issuing commands. Within minutes, messages went out to every human world and every military installation. Shipyards that had spent 3 centuries building exploration vessels and cargo haulers received new blueprints. Factories that made consumer goods retooled their assembly lines. Orbital foundries that produced construction materials switched to military production. The transformation happened faster than anyone thought possible because the plans had always been there waiting. Young men and women flooded recruitment centers. The attack on New Haven had shocked humanity out of its peaceful complacency. Everyone wanted to serve. Everyone wanted to fight. Training facilities that had handled a few thousand recruits per year suddenly processed hundreds of thousands. Veterans who had retired decades ago volunteered to return to service. Admiral Walsh was given command of the first response fleet with orders to stop the Krillian advance at any cost. His second-in-command was Commander Nicole Park, who was 39 years old and had spent her entire career studying military history and tactical theory. She had never fought in a real battle because there had been no battles to fight, but she had analyzed every conflict humanity had ever been involved in. She knew every strategy and counter-strategy. She understood logistics and supply lines and the psychology of warfare. The first response fleet consisted of 37 warships that had been kept in storage and maintained for exactly this scenario. They were old designs from the war against the Zentari, but they had been upgraded over the centuries, with new weapons and better shields. Walsh took command of the flagship Valiant Dawn, which was a heavy cruiser bristling with missile tubes and railguns. Nicole coordinated with the other captains to develop their battle plan. Intelligence reported that the Krillians were moving toward another colony called Shepherd's Rest. It was a mining world with 2 million inhabitants. Walsh decided to make his stand there. He would not let another human world burn without a fight. The fleet arrived at Shepherd's Rest 3 days before the Krillians. They had time to set up defensive positions and coordinate with the ground forces. When the Krillian fleet dropped out of hyperspace, they expected to find another defenseless colony. Instead, they found 37 human warships waiting in formation. High Chancellor Victor was not with this attack force. He had sent one of his subordinates with 50 ships to crush Shepherd's Rest. The Krillian commander hesitated for just a moment when he saw the human fleet. Then he remembered his orders and his duty to Krillian honor. He commanded his ships to attack, and the first real battle in 300 years began. The Battle of Shepherd's Rest lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, the Krillians understood they had made a terrible mistake. Admiral Walsh had positioned his fleet in a defensive sphere around the planet with overlapping fields of fire. When the Krillian commander ordered the attack, his ships charged forward in their traditional wedge formation. It was a tactic that had worked for them in hundreds of battles against other species. But Nicole had studied that exact formation in her tactical analyses, and she knew its weakness. She waited until the Krillian ships were committed to their approach vector, and then she gave the order to split the human formation. Half the fleet dove below the plane of battle, while the other half rose above it. The Krillians found themselves caught in a crossfire with human missiles and railgun rounds coming from multiple angles. The Krillian ships had thick armor and powerful shields, but they were designed for frontal assaults. Their weakest points were the engine sections at the rear and the sensor arrays on top. Nicole had targeted exactly those vulnerabilities. Human missiles struck with precision, guided by advanced targeting computers. The first wave of Krillian ships lost power and drifted helplessly. The second wave tried to adjust their formation, but it was too late. Walsh ordered all ships to focus fire on the Krillian flagship. Dozens of missiles converged on the massive vessel and overwhelmed its shields. The flagship exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire battlefield. Without their commander, the Krillian formation fell apart. Some ships tried to retreat while others fought on alone. The human fleet hunted them down methodically. Of the 50 Krillian warships that entered the system, only 3 managed to escape into hyperspace. News of the victory spread quickly. On Earth, people celebrated in the streets. President Claire Morgan addressed the nation again, and her voice was stronger now. She said that humanity would defend every colony and protect every citizen. She said that the Krillians had awakened something they did not understand. But Claire took no joy in the victory because she knew this was only the beginning. Admiral Walsh sent his report to Frontier Command along with detailed sensor recordings of the battle. Military analysts studied every second of the engagement. They noted that Krillian ships were slower than human vessels but had heavier armor. They noted that Krillian weapons had longer range but less accuracy. Most importantly, they noted that Krillian tactics were rigid and predictable. The enemy followed ancient battle doctrines without adapting to changing situations. Across the galaxy, other species watched these developments with growing concern. The Valkyrie were an insectoid race that had been neighbors with humanity for 2 centuries. They had always maintained friendly relations and traded extensively with human worlds. Their ambassador to Earth requested an urgent meeting with President Morgan. When they met in the White House, the Valkyrie ambassador delivered a warning. He told Claire that 6 other alien empires had been secretly supporting the Krillians. They had provided intelligence and resources. They had encouraged Victor to test human defenses. These empires believed that humanity had become too influential, and they wanted to see human power diminished. The ambassador said his people wanted no part in this conspiracy and would remain neutral, but he felt humanity deserved to know the truth. Claire thanked the ambassador for his honesty and asked if he could provide names of the conspirators. The Valkyrie diplomat hesitated but then listed them: the Zorvath Collective, the Ragnar clans, the Matherian Commonwealth, the Drexen Unity, the Carthax Empire, and the Solari Federation. All of them were major powers with significant military forces. Claire realized that even if humanity defeated the Krillians, they might face attacks from these other empires. She needed to send a message that would discourage any further aggression. She needed to show such overwhelming strength that no one would dare challenge humanity again. Daniel Hayes and his crew had been reassigned from exploration to military intelligence. The Horizon's Edge was fast and equipped with advanced sensors, making it perfect for reconnaissance missions. Sophie's knowledge of alien biology and culture proved invaluable in analyzing enemy behavior. She studied everything they knew about Krillian society and psychology. She discovered that the Krillians had a rigid honor code that valued courage in battle above all else. A Krillian warrior who read her. Etid was considered worse than dead. They were exiled from their clans and stripped of their names. This cultural trait made them fierce fighters, but it also made them inflexible. They would rather die than withdraw even from hopeless situations. Admiral Walsh used this information to develop new strategies. Instead of trying to destroy every enemy ship, he focused on creating situations where Krillian commanders would refuse to retreat. He would bait them into traps and let their honor codes seal their fate. Nicole refined these plans with mathematical precision. She calculated optimal firing solutions and predicted enemy movements based on their cultural programming. Together, Walsh and Nicole became the most effective command team in human military history. Their fleet grew larger every week as new ships came online from the shipyards. Within 2 months, Walsh commanded 150 warships. He organized them into strike groups that could operate independently or combine for major engagements. The Krillians continued their attacks, but now they met resistance at every turn. Human fleets ambushed their convoys and cut off their supply lines. Krillian colonies that had supported the war effort found themselves blockaded. Victor watched his grand invasion plan fall apart. He had promised his people a quick victory and the conquest of rich human worlds. Instead, his fleets were being destroyed and his empire was losing resources faster than they could be replaced. His advisors began to whisper doubts, but he silenced them with threats. He could not admit failure because that would destroy his authority. He decided to change tactics and strike at Earth itself. The plan was ambitious and desperate. Victor gathered 80 of his best ships and equipped them with experimental stealth technology. Purchased from the Ragnar clans, these ships could mask their energy signatures and avoid detection by normal sensors. He would send them through an unmonitored route around the edge of known space. They would approach Earth from an unexpected direction and launch a devastating attack on humanity's homeworld. If he could destroy Earth's orbital defenses and kill the human leadership, then the war would end. The human colonies would lose coordination and fall apart without their central government. It was a bold plan, and Victor believed it would restore his honor and secure Krillian dominance, but human intelligence had improved dramatically since the war began. Spy networks that had been dormant for centuries were reactivated. Listening posts picked up encrypted Krillian communications. Analysts decoded them and pieced together Victor's plan. Admiral Walsh received the intelligence report while his fleet was patrolling near the frontier. He immediately contacted Frontier Command and requested permission to intercept the stealth fleet. The response came directly from President Morgan. She told him to defend Earth at all costs. Walsh calculated the route the Krillians would take and positioned his forces near Jupiter. The gas giant's massive gravity well and intense radiation would provide cover for an ambush. Nicole studied the terrain and devised a trap that would use Jupiter itself as a weapon. The Battle of Jupiter became the turning point that ended any doubt about human military capability. Lucas Grant worked for 72 hours straight modifying the shields on every ship in Walsh's fleet. He developed a way to reconfigure the shield harmonics to withstand Jupiter's intense radiation belts. This meant human ships could hide inside the magnetosphere, where sensors could not detect them, while the Krillian stealth vessels would be forced to go around. Nicole positioned the fleet in 3 layers within Jupiter's radiation field. The outermost layer would spring the trap and drive the enemy inward where the radiation grew stronger. The middle layer would finish off any ships that tried to fight their way out. The inner layer was the final kill zone where nothing could survive for long. The Krillian stealth fleet arrived exactly when intelligence predicted. 80 ships dropped out of hyperspace on the far side of Jupiter and began their approach to Earth. Their commanders believed they were undetected. They moved confidently through space with their weapons ready for the attack on humanity's homeworld. Admiral Walsh waited until the entire enemy fleet was committed to their trajectory. Then he gave the signal. 40 human warships burst out of Jupiter's radiation storms with shields blazing and weapons hot. The Krillians were caught completely by surprise. Their stealth systems had been focused on avoiding detection from Earth, not from ships hiding in a gas giant. The lead Krillian vessels tried to turn and fight, but their formation was already breaking apart. Nicole's tactical plan worked perfectly. The first wave of human ships drove the Krillians deeper toward Jupiter. The enemy commanders faced an impossible choice. They could retreat and abandon their mission, which would bring dishonor, or they could fight and risk being pushed into the radiation belts. Their cultural conditioning made the decision for them. They chose to fight. Krillian ships fired everything they had at the human vessels, but Walsh's fleet was too fast and too coordinated. They danced through the plasma fire and missile barrages like they had been training for this exact battle their entire lives. The truth was that human pilots had spent 300 years preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Every simulation and every training exercise had been designed to maintain readiness. Now that preparation paid off in blood and fire. The second wave of human ships closed the trap. The Krillian fleet found itself surrounded and being pushed steadily toward Jupiter's killing zone. Their shields began to fail under the intense radiation. Their weapon systems overheated and shut down. Ship after ship lost power and drifted helplessly into the planet's gravity, where they were crushed or torn apart by atmospheric pressure. Some Krillian commanders tried to surrender, but the radiation interference made communication impossible. The battle lasted 8 hours, and when it ended, not a single Krillian vessel remained functional. Admiral Walsh sent a simple message back to Earth. The stealth fleet had been destroyed. Earth was safe. The celebration that followed was more intense than anything since the end of the war with the Zentari 3 centuries ago. High Chancellor Victor received the news. Aboard his flagship at the Krillian throne world, his finest ships were gone. His most experienced commanders were dead. His plan to strike at Earth had failed completely. For the first time since the war began, he felt something he had not experienced in decades. He felt fear. His advisors stood in silence, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he asked how this was possible. How had the humans detected the stealth fleet? How had they positioned forces for an ambush? How had they won so decisively against superior numbers? His intelligence chief explained that human capabilities had been severely underestimated. Their sensors were more advanced than Krillian technology. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable. Their tactics were flexible and adaptive. Most importantly, their industrial capacity was overwhelming. For every ship the Krillians destroyed, the humans built 3 more. Victor demanded a full assessment of human military strength. What he learned made his blood run cold. In the 6 months since the attack on New Haven, humanity had produced over 300 warships. Their orbital foundries worked around the clock. Their factories operated at capacity that should have been impossible. Every human world contributed to the war effort. There were no complaints about rationing or sacrifice. The entire species had united with singular purpose. The intelligence chief showed him intercepted communications from human worlds. Parents sent their children to serve. Workers volunteered for double shifts. Scientists developed new weapons. Everyone contributed however they could. This was not the behavior of a soft, peaceful civilization. This was a war machine that had been waiting dormant for 3 centuries, and now it was fully awake. The Krillian Empire's outer colonies began to fall. Human strike groups moved through Krillian space with impunity. They destroyed military installations and orbital defenses. But they did something else that shocked the galaxy. They liberated slaves. Daniel Hayes and his crew were part of a reconnaissance mission to survey a Krillian mining world called Krell 9. What they found there horrified them. Thousands of aliens from 3 different species worked in brutal conditions mining rare metals. The slaves included Valkyrie civilians who had been captured in raids over the past decade. There were families with children as young as 5 years old working in the mines. Sophie documented everything they saw. She recorded the conditions and interviewed freed slaves. The evidence was damning. President Claire Morgan reviewed the reports with her cabinet. She had known the Krillians used slave labor, but seeing the reality was different from reading intelligence summaries. She made a decision that changed the nature of the war. She addressed the Galactic Council via holographic transmission. Representatives from every major species watched as she presented the evidence of Krillian atrocities. She showed them images of child slaves and mass graves. She showed them work camps where aliens were beaten and starved. Then she declared that humanity would not stop fighting until every slave was freed and every Krillian war criminal faced justice. This was no longer just about defending human colonies. This was about standing up for all oppressed peoples in the galaxy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Public opinion across multiple war. LDS turned against the Krillian Empire. The 6 species that had secretly supported Victor quickly distanced themselves. They sent apologies to Earth and offered humanitarian aid. The Valkyrie went further and offered military support. Their fleet was small compared to humanity's, but the gesture meant everything. Admiral Walsh launched Operation Thunderstrike with 150 warships and 20 Valkyrie cruisers. Their objective was to liberate every slave camp in Krillian space. Ryan Mitchell was 45 years old when he joined the Marines. He had worked in a factory on new Pittsburgh building engines for cargo ships. When the war started, his factory retooled to produce military equipment. Ryan worked 18-hour days helping manufacture weapons and armor. But it was not enough. His daughter, Katie, was serving as a medic aboard the Valiant Dawn. She sent him messages describing the horrors she witnessed treating wounded civilians from attacked colonies. Ryan decided he needed to do more. He signed up despite being older than most recruits. The training was brutal, but he pushed through. He became part of a Marine battalion. Specializing in boarding actions and ground assault, his unit was assigned to Operation Thunderstrike. They would board Krillian facilities and secure them while freeing the slaves. The first target was Krell 5, which held over 10,000 prisoners from multiple species. The assault began with human ships destroying the orbital defenses. Then dropships carried Marines to the surface. Ryan and his squad landed near the main entrance to the underground facility. The fighting was close and brutal in the narrow corridors. Krillian guards fought with desperate ferocity, knowing they faced trial for war crimes if captured. Ryan's training took over as he moved through the facility with his squad. They cleared room after room and freed hundreds of slaves. In one section, Ryan found a group of Valkyrie children huddled in a cell. The oldest was maybe 12 years old. He carried them out under covering fire from his squad mates and delivered them to the medics waiting outside. The liberation of slave camps across Krillian space took 3 months and freed over 2 million beings from captivity. Each victory brought more intelligence about Krillian military positions and defensive capabilities. The freed slaves told their rescuers everything they knew about guard rotations and facility layouts and supply routes. Sophie interviewed hundreds of them and compiled detailed reports. One pattern emerged clearly from all the testimonies. The Krillians had pulled most of their remaining fleet back to their throne world of Krillis. Prime High Chancellor Victor was making his last stand at the heart of his empire. He had abandoned the outer colonies and concentrated everything he had left around his homeworld. It was a defensive posture born of desperation. Admiral Walsh gathered his commanders aboard the Valiant Dawn to plan the final assault. Nicole had spent weeks analyzing the defenses around Krillis Prime. The planet was protected by 300 warships, including Victor's personal flagship. There were dozens of orbital weapons platforms with enough firepower to devastate an attacking fleet. A planetary shield covered the major cities and military installations. Breaking through those defenses using conventional tactics would cost thousands of human lives and take months of sustained bombardment. Walsh refused to accept those casualties. He asked Nicole if there was another way. She studied the tactical displays for a long moment, and then she smiled. She said there was always another way if you were willing to think like the enemy and then do exactly what they would never expect. That Nicole proposed a strategy based on psychological warfare combined with overwhelming force. The human fleet would arrive at Krillis Prime with every ship they had. 300 warships plus support vessels and carriers with fighter squadrons. It would be the largest military force humanity had assembled since the war with the Zentari, but they would not attack immediately. Instead, Walsh would offer Victor one final chance to surrender. The offer would include terms that allowed the Krillian people to maintain their dignity while their leadership faced justice. Nicole believed that Victor's pride would force him to refuse, but the offer would accomplish two things. It would show the galaxy that humanity preferred peace even at the moment of total victory, and it would give ordinary Krillian citizens time to question their leader's decisions. President Claire Morgan approved the plan. She recorded a message that would be broadcast to every Krillian world. She spoke directly to the Krillian people and explained that humanity had no quarrel with them. She said that their leaders had started an unjust war and committed terrible crimes, but that did not make every Krillian responsible. She offered reconstruction aid and fair treatment to any colony that laid down arms. She promised that human occupation would be temporary and focused only on ensuring justice for victims and preventing future aggression. But she also made clear that if fighting continued, then humanity would use every weapon at their disposal to end the war quickly and completely. The human fleet assembled at a staging point 2 days from Krillis Prime. Daniel Hayes and the crew of the Horizons Edge joined the Armada as part of the reconnaissance squadron. Amy had been training other pilots in advanced maneuvering techniques. Lucas had helped upgrade the engine systems on dozens of ships. Sophie continued her intelligence work, analyzing enemy communications and behavior patterns. They had started this journey as explorers mapping unknown space, and now they were part of the largest military operation in human history. Daniel stood on his bridge and looked at the fleet assembled around them. Hundreds of ships stretching as far as sensors could detect. It was beautiful and terrible at
the same time. Katie Mitchell worked in the medical bay of the Valiant Dawn, preparing for the casualties that would inevitably come. She had been a medic for 8 months now, and had treated everything from minor injuries to critical wounds. She thought about her father Ryan, who was aboard a troop transport with his Marine battalion. They would be part of the ground assault if it came to that. She tried not to worry, but it was impossible. War had brought them both into service, and now they faced the final battle. She checked her supplies one more time and made sure everything was ready. Other medics worked around her with the same quiet intensity. Everyone knew what was coming. The fleet arrived at Krillis Prime and took up positions outside the range of the orbital platforms. Admiral Walsh broadcast his message to High Chancellor Victor. He offered surrender terms that included safe passage for Krillian civilians and fair trials for military leaders. He gave Victor 12 hours to respond. The Krillian leader's reply came after only 2 hours. He appeared on the communication channel, wearing his full ceremonial armor. He said that Krillians do not surrender and that humanity would break itself against the defenses of his homeworld. He said that every Krillian would fight to the last breath rather than accept defeat. He said that history would remember this as the day human arrogance was punished. Then he ordered his fleet to attack. The Battle of Krillis Prime lasted 3 days and became the defining moment that shaped galactic politics for the next century. The Krillian fleet charged forward in their traditional formation with honor and courage, but without the flexibility needed to counter human tactics. Nicole had predicted their every move. She had studied 300 years of Krillian military history and understood exactly how they would fight. The human fleet split into strike groups that isolated enemy ships and destroyed them with concentrated fire. Fighter squadrons launched from carriers and swarmed the orbital platforms. Pilots like Jake Sullivan and Megan Torres flew through defensive fire with precision that seemed impossible. They disabled platform after platform while the capital ships engaged the Krillian fleet. Lucas Grant's engineering innovations proved decisive. Human ships maintained shield integrity far longer than Krillian projections suggested. When enemy vessels concentrated fire on what should have been weak points, they found reinforced systems that absorbed the damage. Lucas had personally upgraded the power distribution networks on 60 ships. His modifications allowed them to redirect energy from non-essential systems to shields during combat. It gave human vessels a crucial advantage in sustained engagements. The Krillian ships were tough and well-armed, but they could not adapt when their weapons failed to achieve expected results. On the second day of battle, Ryan Mitchell's Marine Battalion received their orders. The orbital platforms were neutralized, and the planetary shield had failed in several locations. Ground forces would deploy to secure key installations and capture Krillian leadership. Ryan and his unit boarded dropships and descended through the atmosphere while human fighters provided cover. They landed near the capital city, where intelligence indicated Victor had retreated to his command bunker. The fighting in the streets was intense, but brief. Most Krillian ground forces had already surrendered once they realized their fleet was destroyed. Only the elite guard units around Victor's position continued to resist. Daniel Hayes led a strike team with a specific mission. They would infiltrate the command bunker and capture the High Chancellor alive. Sophie came with them because she understood Krillian psychology better than anyone. They fought through 3 levels of security before reaching the inner sanctum, where Victor waited with his personal guards. The Krillian leader stood in his war room, surrounded by tactical displays showing the complete destruction of his fleet. He looked at Daniel and demanded to be killed in battle rather than captured. Daniel refused. He told Victor that he would face trial and answer for his crimes. He told him that the galaxy would see justice done. The Krillian fleet surrendered after 70 hours of continuous battle. Of 300 ships that began the engagement, fewer than 30 remained functional. The orbital defenses were completely destroyed. Krillian military power was broken forever. President Claire Morgan arrived at Krillis Prime aboard the diplomatic vessel Unity. She broadcast to the entire galaxy from the Krillian throne world. She said that humanity had not wanted this war, but would always defend itself and its allies. She said that the occupation would be fair and temporary. She said that reconstruction would begin immediately, and that the Krillian people would be treated with dignity. But she also made clear that war criminals would face justice, and that the galaxy had witnessed what happened when humanity was forced to fight.